I'm the Vice President for Community Engagement at WFYI Public Media. On behalf of our team and our partners at the Savvy Project at the Polis Center at IUPUI, I am so very pleased to welcome you to this Savvy Talks. We've been collaborating for 5 years to host these data-informed community conversations about critical issues that face our community. We hope that these discussions have informed programming, policy, and strategic decisions, and we think you're in for another great session. I'd like you to please join me in welcoming Sharon Kandris, the Associate Director of the Polis Center. Sharon, thanks for your partnership.
Thank you, Gail, and same to you, and also welcome to everyone. I am so pleased to point out that the Polis Center and WFI are expanding our partnership, and over the next 2 years, we're going to be focusing on topics related to equity, economic opportunity, and social justice. Today kicks off a series of events, discussions, reports, and stories that dig into data and lived experiences. So next month, April 22nd, save the date, we're going to focus on equity and aging. And later this year, we'll focus on equity and life expectancy and in criminal justice. We just launched an equity data and information hub on savi.org, where you will find the report from today, along with a lot of other great content related to equity. In the future, there'll also be follow-up stories available on WFYI. So today's agenda is a simple one. We'll have a presentation followed by a panel discussion. And because of the large audience, we'll be taking questions through the Q&A feature that you can find on your control bar. Please be sure to submit questions throughout at any time, as our team will be responding to those questions throughout the event. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for today, Jill Sheridan. Jill is the government and policy reporter for WFYI, and in addition has covered health and other beats for Indiana Public Broadcasting. You have heard her on her stories on NPR, and as a guest host for All In. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Really excited to be here today covering this important topic with this new research that we're looking at out of Savvy, something that I've been interested in for many years as we do work together, place and how it relates to opportunity, whether that be economic, health opportunity, social opportunities. So we have a lot of really great information today. Again, your Q&A is open if you'd like to ask questions during the presentation, and then afterwards we'll be having a discussion with our panelists from the community. So I'd love to introduce now our presenters and our researchers. We have Rebecca Nannery, who's a senior research analyst at the Polis Center. Matt Nowlin will be presenting today. He's a user experience designer, again with the Polis Center. And Eric Steiner is co-director of the Spatial History Project at Stanford University. And I believe that Eric will be kicking us off today. Thank you all for being here.
My name is Eric Steiner. Today my colleagues and I will be presenting on equality of opportunity, how class, race, and place impact economic mobility in Indianapolis. I'd like to begin by acknowledging my co-authors and collaborators on this project, Sharon, Unai, Rebecca, Jeremy, and Matt at the Polis Center. And just to give you a sense of what the structure will be for the presentation, I'll be beginning with a discussion of the basis for our work, which is largely based on the research of Harvard economist Raj Chetty. I'll then situate Indianapolis in regional and national trends before Matt will pick up and discuss some of the more local dynamics, and in particular some neighborhoods where we see some of these patterns playing out. And finally, Rebecca will end with a discussion of some of the policy implications coming out of this work. I'd just like to take a moment, if I may, just on a personal note, just to acknowledge my position as an outsider in this conversation, at least with respect to Indianapolis. Although I'm from Pennsylvania and most of my family is from the Midwest, I've really spent the most of my adult life on the West Coast. I want to acknowledge that the solutions to wicked problems of race and class and community development are really things that need to be responsive to local communities and neighborhoods with local actors, agitators, policy specialists, and local officials. So I'm really grateful that we have this opportunity for discussion with our panelists today. I really look forward to this discussion and engagement from those of you in the audience as well. I'd really frame this as the beginning of a discussion and conversation. The work of our team here at the Polis Center, quite frankly, it just barely scratches the surface of the data and issues that we're dealing with here. And I think I speak for everyone in saying that we really look forward to the directions that this discussion can give us to help focus any future investigations more deeply. Economic mobility can be thought about in many ways. Climbing rank or position in an organization, in your career, the impact of savings and investments on long-term earnings, the ability to move between careers, etc. But the type of mobility that we'll be talking about today and that governs a lot of the work of, or drives a lot of the work of Raj Chetty, is intergenerational income mobility. That is, how likely are you to achieve the so-called American dream, rags to riches, or just simply moving up the income ladder relative to your parents? Chetty has been making big waves and garnering a lot of media attention for his work, essentially declaring the American dream dead, pointing out that a massive increase in inequality in the last 50 years has led to a related massive decline in the ability to out-earn our parents. The roots of this problem are really complex and varied depending on which subgroup you study. But the basic answer to the question of whether class, race, and place matter is a resounding yes. How well you do in adulthood is in a way predetermined by A, the income of your parents, B, your race, and C, where you grow up. These factors matter, and in that order. And they matter more than you might think, more than local economic factors like jobs and wage growth or innovation or politics, healthcare, immigration, trade policies, all these things that really govern the national conversation, but really at the root of it that really undergirds the kind of stuckness of the system that we have right now that is preventing people from moving up the income ladder is really class, race, and place. In short, continuing an investment in combating poverty, rooting out systemic racism, and strengthening our local communities is absolutely imperative. So yes, also to you. Yes to the fact that you're here today as a citizen, facilitator, community organizer, advocate, whatever position or multiple positions that you bring to the conversation. Knowing that place matters in particular, I think, is crucial. Chetty states flatly, in fact, that 2/3 of the variation in how well we do in adulthood can be explained by where we grow up, even if you treat it independently of class and race. I take this to mean that all the work that people are doing, that you are doing on schools and housing and public parks and public art, etc., it's not just window dressing, but it really can have lasting effects. Okay, so let's jump into looking at some of the data behind this study. There's a really powerful aspect to some of the work that Chetty has done, which is that he's undertaken the largest ever study conducted on intergenerational mobility in America. And he did this in collaboration with the IRS and Census Bureau. What he's able to do is take 20 million people's 2015 tax returns and census records from 2010, and he did the hard labor, he and his team, of course, did the hard labor of linking those individuals back to their parents. And then also to their parents' tax returns and their parents' census records. And so really for the first time do we have a real large enough sample to be able to examine in depth how people do in relation to their parents. If you plot the data comparing parent income and child income, you can imagine that in a kind of perfectly opportunistic society, your parent in the household in which you grow up, low income or high income, you would essentially have a kind of equal chance of reaching other income brackets. If you plot this out for every single percentile in the distribution, these 20 million people, you can see that it's a fairly consistent linear pattern. Mathematically speaking, it's the slope of this line that describes the concept of relative mobility. That is, how effective you are as a society in rebalancing wealth within a generation and between generations to make opportunity more equal for everyone involved. In and of itself, this is problematic, but it's particularly problematic when we start to look at individual subgroups. And this is where we transition to the issue of race. When we look at where, on average, white Americans fall on this distribution, it's at about the 58th percentile versus black Americans at the 32nd or 33rd percentile. This is about a 25 percentile difference. So you can imagine that this distinction perhaps could erode over time as there's a rebalancing effect, which Chetty argues is difficult across multiple generations. It takes time to move across multiple generations, but also that the curves look slightly different for black Americans as they do for white Americans. And he argues that this relationship is in a, quote, steady state in which systemic racism and bias have caused this distribution to be as it is, and that in the future you should see a very similar kind of arrangement where multiple generations from now you could see the same effect without any change, where black Americans are still sitting at the 32nd, 33rd percentile, with white Americans sitting above the median. This distinction can perhaps best be illustrated by another type of graphic. We just look at the segment of the population that grows up in a low-income situation, and we can compare outcomes between black boys and white boys, in particular in those situations. You can see there's a pretty dramatic difference between where black and white children end up. In this case, we're looking at men in particular. White boys are 3 times as more likely as black boys to reach higher income brackets, and almost half of black boys that grow up in low-income households will stay low-income in adulthood. Now, if you move that forward to the next generation and look explicitly at boys that grow up in high-income households, you'll see there are pretty dramatic racial differences here as well. Of the very few black men that reach high-income brackets as adults, very few of them will have children that maintain high incomes in their adulthood. The majority of black boys will end up in lower income brackets, whereas white boys will tend to, at a very high rate, almost 40% rate, stay in a high income situation. It's this intergenerational distinction of maintaining wealth that really needs to be addressed on a systemic basis to be able to improve the condition for the black population, and in particular, as I say, black men. So just to summarize Chetty's conclusions on race, first, black children tend to be stuck in lower income brackets relative to white children. There's lower rates of upward mobility and higher rates of downward mobility across generations. Second, that short-term policy solutions that don't affect multiple generational change will ultimately fail. There is cause for some optimism, though, when it comes to the issues of race. First, relative to their own parents, black children are not stuck in low-income brackets. And so there isn't something in particular going on with black children being more stuck relative to their parents than white children. It's just simply this black-white difference that needs to be addressed. And second, and this is a good transition into the topic of place, black children do slightly better in certain kinds of neighborhoods. As it turns out, while there's still stark differences between how well they support black and white mobility, certain qualities of neighborhoods do play a big role. Again, place matters. Chetty goes through tremendous effort to show this. He studies kids that move when they're young, kids that move when they're older, siblings that move together, siblings that move to different places. He controls for parent incomes, whether parents get new jobs, for race, for gender, whether or not kids are in single parent households, whether they're in two-parent households. And in the end, his big data approach, using these 20 million kids that he tracked, he tells a pretty convincing story that the neighborhood you grow up in matters tremendously. The most useful public-facing result of his work, and he has a tremendous amount of content online that I really encourage you to explore, but the most useful public-facing result of his work is this immensely detailed map of the United States called the Opportunity Atlas. And it shows the outcomes for every neighborhood in America for kids that grew up in that neighborhood in the cohort that we're describing, which is the 80s and 90s, the most recent cohort that we can study in depth. I just want to jump over to the Opportunity Atlas website to give you a sense of the value of this site and encourage you to explore it on your own. This map represents, you see the scale down here, the average income of the children that grew up in each of these cities around the country during the period of time that we're describing. So these are kids that were born in the early 80s, and their income was measured in adulthood in 2015. And he's comparing here, the atlas compares the outcomes for each place in the United States for that cohort. Now, the real powerful thing about the atlas, of course, you can zoom in and out and investigate areas in detail, and I'll show you that resolution. But I first want to show you that you can filter it by parent income, along with many other variables, but the basic one is by parent income. So what we're looking at here is how well children do that are born into high-income families and where they do better. Of course, what's more interesting to us in this study is looking at low income and how well they do. You can also divide it by race and by gender. And so it's by using these various combinations that you're able to see how these patterns play out, both at the national and regional scale, as well as examining as you zoom in. It'll update to show the census tract level at the finest level of detail. And so it's with this tool that you're able to really see how the variation in place affects economic outcomes. There are any number of neighborhood characteristics and variables that you can examine in correlation with these and across these subgroups, as well as download the data and work with it yourself. Before I continue, I just want to address criticism of this map and Chetty's work, and that is that this kind of represents a modern-day redlining. That is to say, a way to label which neighborhoods are good and which ones are bad, and has the potential to reinforce already sticky patterns of inequities. I think it's a fair criticism, and I'm definitely not here to defend Chetty, but I want to invite you to think about the motivation here, less to label, but more to make economic mobility more actionable from a policy perspective, and less wicked and fixed in historical patterns. Chetty's work cracks a nut that plagues most economic analyses. That is, when you see that people in different places end up with different outcomes, you simply cannot tell if it's because the people that happen to live there, their race or gender, ethnicity or educational background, motivations, interests, etc., or if it's something to do with the place itself. Intuitively, we know place matters, otherwise we wouldn't invest so much energy into it. But what Chetty's study has been able to do is really separate the effect of neighborhoods on economic mobility independent of all the other demographic, cultural, employment type factors. I see this view as highly optimistic. The study does more to identify collective potential than to really highlight the good and bad, so-called good and bad neighborhoods. Jumping back to our slide deck and looking at the national scale here, When people first look at maps like this, they start to wonder, there has to be something going on in these different areas that are causing these different outcomes. And the first inclination is to really think about issues of the local economy, the number of jobs, growth in jobs over time, and other traditional variables like growth in wages over time. Chetty points out that that in fact, if you look at those variables, they aren't highly correlated with these outcomes. In fact, something like percent job growth over time, looking at on the x-axis percent job growth from 1990 to 2010, which is the critical period for this cohort, and compare that to our standard outcome variable, which is median household income for children growing up in low-income families. You might expect a pretty linear relationship here, which is that as there is higher job growth, then you'll see better outcomes for people in those areas. Well, in fact, on a national level, but also in this case, I'll just be looking at Midwestern cities, the pattern is highly variable and almost uncorrelated, which is to say that you get a lot of situations where you get places like Wheeling or Pittsburgh where you have low percent job growth, but you have really pretty high outcomes for people growing up in those cities. Meanwhile, you have places like Indianapolis where you have really high job growth in terms of percentage and really low outcomes overall. This pattern also holds for wage growth and other factors, and really makes you question, what are the key things that are driving this distribution, as well as, of course, what policies might be in place to encourage growth in intergenerational mobility that don't necessarily align with the typical economic dials that we imagine are controlling it. So that's a bit of a teaser on how well Indianapolis is doing, so to speak, how it falls on this particular metric. Let's look at that in a little more detail before Matt goes into the neighborhood level. If you look at this pattern regionally, you can see a lot of the cities in the South are doing quite poorly in comparison to, say, the Northeast and West Coast, where you see really high income outcomes for low-income children growing up in low-income situations. It's even the case for places like Charlotte that fall in here, where you've got a kind of a model economy, really high wage growth and job growth, and yet really pretty low outcomes. Indianapolis and Muncie, incidentally, fall dead last amongst commuting zones of the Midwest, as well as essentially last amongst all commuting zones really outside the South. And if you look at Indianapolis in relation to the kind of top population areas of the country, you can see that amongst the top 50 largest commuting zones in the country, you'll see Pittsburgh up here, and then you'll see Indianapolis is really very close to the bottom and really on par with most of these southern cities in here, Atlanta and Charlotte, Raleigh, Virginia Beach, etc. So what is going on here, and what can we do to think about how to understand these patterns in more depth? I'm just going to jump back here briefly to the atlas itself and start to look at how Indianapolis sits really at the intersection of two broad regional patterns. One is a pattern of really low opportunity for the white population in the South, and in particular the Appalachian states, and bleeding over into the Midwest. It may or may not surprise you to learn that the Midwest has the lowest rates of mobility for the black population of anywhere in the country, even for the historically racist Deep South or the inner cities of the Northeast. Indianapolis is no exception to that Midwestern pattern. And in fact, opportunities are quite low for both blacks and whites growing up in Indianapolis. So above all, it's the confluence of those two key factors that makes Indianapolis rank the way it does on the national distribution. But what I think is really key is just to start to look at how Chetty correlates that with other variables that help us get a better handle on what policy implications there might be. Chetty and his colleagues looked at a huge number of variables to try to correlate them with the outcomes we're seeing on these maps. Whether it's local government expenditures, tax rates, high school dropout rates, unemployment, manufacturing economy, immigration levels, Chinese imports, median home values, crime rates, and many other variables. And they found that amongst those are really 5 key factors that have the strongest correlations to the outcomes we're looking at here. That is the incomes of children growing up in low-income situations. These are, in no particular order, income inequality, as measured by the size of the middle class, or percent under the poverty level, or something called the Gini coefficient. Secondly, segregation, both racial and economic, has a really strong correlation with outcomes. Thirdly, family structure. It turns out that the number of families that are single-parent households in a neighborhood, regardless of whether or not a child itself is in a single-parent family, has a strong correlation with outcomes for people in that neighborhood. Fourth, school quality. It's difficult to measure school quality, but the use of test scores, student-teacher ratios, and school expenditures seems to correlate well with outcomes for people in neighborhoods. And lastly, something called social capital or social cohesion, which, again, difficult to measure, but it appears that it does correlate. And the metric that they use in their study is to look at the percentage of people that return census forms. And they find that even something as crude as that kind of measure relates to the level of opportunity in those neighborhoods. Now, it's important to note that these are 5 factors he identifies. He doesn't specify which one is more important than others, and that also it's really important to recognize these are correlations and not causations. And so the mechanisms behind each of these is unclear and deserves a lot further study. But these are the kind of key correlations that I think are worth pursuing a little bit further. If we look at that top 50 city metric or ranking that we saw earlier, and we just kind of imagine that graphically with the top city at the top of this bar and the bottom city at the bottom of the bar, and we look across these 5 metrics, you can see where Indianapolis ranks in relation to a couple other Midwestern cities, Columbus and Pittsburgh. Looking across those 5 factors, you can see there's a lot of variation. You can see that a place like Pittsburgh, which ends up actually doing quite well on the general metric, has a lot of variability, just like Indianapolis does on all of these metrics. So it's a kind of a mixed story. It's really hard to kind of see what's going on here. One of the things we did was we performed a cluster analysis of this data. And we took those top 50 cities and we did a cluster analysis which looks at all these variables and tries to find cities that have similar patterns across those variables, in a sense to try to understand who the peer cities are for each city. The way to interpret this graphic is first to notice the range of light blue to dark blue colors. On each of the factors that I mentioned on the previous slide, the cities are ranked. A light color means that they are ranking high or kind of a positive characteristic. A dark value here indicates a low score or negative characteristic for that city. With this analysis, we identified 4 clusters, and with the cluster analysis, it doesn't identify why they're clustered. It just simply says these cities have a similar pattern, and so it's up to us to make that interpretation. What you see here in this first cluster, you see mostly white cities that are characterized by low black populations, And really what you see here are really high, relatively high ranks on most of the measures. You can see it just in a kind of overall impression, you see a kind of lighter tone to this block than you do to this one. The second set of cities really might be characterized as diverse coastal and southwestern cities. These are cities that generally have high rates of mobility, despite pretty high levels of income inequality. You can see these also have low levels of social capital, but these are cities that are characterized by their diversity. They have relatively low racial segregation, so this could be a driving factor for the success of some of these cities. If we scroll down and look at the last two clusters, the third cluster is kind of average to low rates of overall mobility. And these are ones that are what I'm titling the white Midwestern and Southern cities. You can see these have relatively average scores, but you can see that some of the factors like school quality have a kind of inverse relationship almost, where some of the areas with really high school qualities are actually performing really low within this cluster. And so it really appears that also the case with family structure. There seems to be almost an inverse relationship. So these may be less important factors for this cluster of cities. And it might be something more like this first column, which is the income inequality column, that seems to really differentiate how well different cities do in this cluster. And Indianapolis falls in here, as we talked about before, its relationship to some of the other southern cities. So it may be the levels of inequality and segregation that are the biggest factors. Segregation is a major driving factor in this last cluster, which are really the mid-sized black cities. Social capital does not appear to be a factor in differentiating them. These are ones that are really characterized by high black population. So the real story here is that it's a mixed bag. There do seem to be some leads that help differentiate them, but overall there's a lot of variability in how these variables correlate across space. That level of variability is shared at the national, regional, and local level. I think this is a good segue into the next part of the talk, which is to say that we don't need to look to other cities or regions to think about or to observe how opportunity works. We can look within our own city and see that same degree of variability. I'll turn it over to Matt now, who will start to talk about some of the patterns that we see at the local level.
As Eric showed, economic opportunity in Indianapolis is lower than almost any other large city, despite having underlying socioeconomic factors that are average or above average. Now we want to understand how some of these factors can affect opportunity at the neighborhood level. We're going to look at a series of charts that show the average adult income of people born in each census tract. Each line on this chart represents the average child that grew up in a low-income household in one of Central Indiana's 400 census tracts. Everyone in this chart started from the same place. Their parents were at the 25th percentile in terms of household income, meaning they earned $27,000 a year. They ended up in vastly different places, ranging from the 25th percentile to the 50th percentile and even higher. Most folks who grew up in this situation ended up around the 35th to the 45th percentile. You can see that in some neighborhoods, economic outcomes were better than in others. The purple neighborhoods shown in this map represent the lower end of the chart. Those folks that grew up to earn incomes at the 25th to the 35th percentile. The dark green areas are folks who grew up to earn the highest incomes in this range, at or near the 50th percentile. Now we highlight neighborhoods with the lowest median household income. Even though the incomes of the children and families in our chart didn't change, their economic outcomes are worse than their peers who grew up in higher income neighborhoods. This chart shows the opposite. We've highlighted the tracts with the highest median household income. These children started at the 25th percentile like everyone else, but often moved up to the 35th or 40th percentile in adulthood. This represents more than $10,000 per year in increased earnings due to growing up in a different neighborhood. Children who grew up in redline neighborhoods have worse outcomes than their peers. The highlighted neighborhoods were redlined in the 1930s as part of a federal program that discouraged mortgage lending in communities of color. 90 years later, we still see a stark impact on opportunity for children born here. Neighborhoods with a high share of single-parent households tend to have lower economic opportunity. Children who grow up in these neighborhoods, regardless of if they grow up in a single-parent household themselves, earn less as adults on average. You can see in this chart the highlighted neighborhoods are located mostly in the core of Indianapolis and on the west and east sides. And in the chart we see that those highlighted neighborhoods on average have lower economic outcomes. You can also use these data to understand specific neighborhoods. Low-income children who grew up in the Northeast neighborhood area, south of 56th Street and west of Post Road, have outcomes that are just below average compared to Indianapolis overall. Children who grew up here have adult incomes ranging from $22,000 to $27,000 a year. The Northwest neighborhood has similar patterns. However, we do see one outlier. Children who grew up in the southeastern tract in Speedway earned more money as adults on average than children from the other tracts. We will see on the next slide that this is more about the demographics of that tract than anything else. White children born in the Northeast and Northwest areas earn $30,000 to $32,000 on average in adulthood, while black children born here earn about $22,000. This is on par with that racial equity gap we saw for the entire city of Indianapolis, which was about $9,000. Almost no black children were born in the outlier tract in Speedway, and so its average opportunity measure is higher.
Good morning. I'm going to discuss some approaches and solutions to building opportunity in our neighborhoods. While voucher programs offer families the opportunity to move to higher income neighborhoods, we are taking the position that communities already have what they need for economic growth, and that directing resources to strengthen communities themselves will result in greater opportunities for current and future generations. This can be understood through endogenous growth theory, which states that the assets that exist in communities are the key to future growth. According to this theory, 4 variables are responsible for the economic growth in a community. Human capital refers to the people who live in communities themselves. Investment in education and health strengthen human capital in communities, such as equitable distribution of resources among local schools and improving access to health care through the availability of affordable health insurance and neighborhood primary care clinics. Physical capital includes the infrastructure within the community, including roads, buildings, transportation systems, and water, to which improvements can be made. Labor is defined by the availability of workers, and technology includes not only connectivity, but also expert knowledge. Available labor is impacted by the challenges parents may face maintaining employment while raising their children, and disproportionate incarceration rates in some neighborhoods. It is also affected by the availability of good paying jobs in an area and the qualifications of residents to obtain these jobs. Social capital is also a key component of communities that knits them together. Bonding social capital represents the ties between members within that community. For instance, neighbors may watch each other's children when needed, or share food when a family is in need. Bridging social capital represents ties between neighborhoods and the ability of residents to obtain what they need that is unavailable in their own neighborhoods. And linking social capital denotes connections to centers of power, including community leaders and others who have access to needed resources or can be influenced as such. We contend that investment in underappreciated neighborhoods is important in part because families rely on bonding social capital in their daily lives. Without it, they may struggle to find an emergency babysitter, someone to repair their car, or a ride to work. It is important to invest in developing bridging and linking social capital in these communities as well, to reintroduce resources that were stripped from communities, particularly communities of color, as a result of historical public policies that introduced inequity nationally and locally. Investment in communities that capitalizes on their existing strengths requires community-driven, purposeful planning. Charlotte was ranked last in the Opportunity Atlas among the 50 largest American cities, and Mecklenburg County was ranked 99 out of 100 counties in terms of upward mobility. In response, in 2015, a group of public and private sector leaders in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area convened as a task force to create a comprehensive plan to address opportunity inequities in their community. The plan they developed accounts for the factors that lead to ongoing conditions of economic inequity by creating an action plan that acknowledges both the enduring impact of segregation as well as the effects of social capital in communities. It focuses on improving determinants likely to impact economic opportunity, social mobility, and quality of life for individuals, including early childcare and education, college and career readiness, and child and family stability. Indicators at the individual, family, community, and system levels are used to assess progress related to opportunity determinants. Finally, we can understand resources brought to bear in communities using the following typology, which takes into account the source of resources through public or private, typically nonprofit, actors who directly benefit from these resources, be it communities as a whole through neighborhood level investments or individuals through direct aid. These include public investments on a community level, such as expanded public transportation in an area, or development of affordable housing and employment opportunities through federal tax credit programs and other funds. Private funders, such as community development finance institutions like LISC Indianapolis, community development corporations, or charitable foundations may also direct resources to targeted communities through initiatives like the Quality of Life neighborhood. Public and private resources are frequently leveraged to maximize impact. Additionally, public resources can be directed toward individuals in the form of cash transfer payments and rental housing and utilities assistance. Private resources may provide similar services, including job training and employment, and financial management programs, such as the Centers for Working Families in Indianapolis. Also, private institutions such as credit unions provide financial education, banking, and riskier loans at competitive rates for individuals and small business owners. Programming that addresses the needs of individuals may also leverage the resources of public and private actors. Investment of resources in our communities is key to addressing existing opportunity inequities.
Thank you, Rebecca. Lots of questions today about, whether or not this information, these slides are going to be available. Yes, they are all available at Savvy's website. So please do check out the report. It's full of obviously really important information. We did have a couple of questions that we wanted to highlight. Again, if you have questions, we're able to answer these with our team of experts and researchers online today. So please feel free to type those in. We talked a little bit about, Indianapolis being on the bottom again, and Rob had a question and Eric answered, what were those two factors and their confluence that makes Indianapolis the lowest in mobility? And I just wanted to highlight what Eric had said. It's the broad regional geographic patterns, the poor outcomes for the white population in the South, and also the poor outcomes for the Black population in the Midwest, and how we kind of sit in the middle there in that intersection, making us land so far down on the list here in Indianapolis. Another highlighted question, I'm wondering where this research is growing from, where this original data came from researcher Chetty. So he has a lot of information as well. He's a Harvard researcher, and you can find all of his information online, and we also have links to that as well. So please continue to put your questions into the question and answer box here as we continue on to our panel discussion. I'm very excited to talk again, as Eric mentioned, the local response to these wicked problems is just so extremely important. And we're going to be able to talk about, what local responses we're seeing here in Indianapolis. Again, obviously such important issues that we want to address here when we're talking about economic opportunity for all. So I'd like to welcome our panelists, and hopefully we will have time for a couple questions for our panelists after the discussion. Patrice Duckett is Executive Director of the Faber-Card Crooked Creek Neighborhood Center. Allison Luthi is the Executive Director at the Martin Luther King Community Center. We have with us today Amy Nelson, Executive Director at Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana, and Pamela Ross, Vice President of Opportunity and Equity and Inclusion at the Central Indiana Community Foundation. So welcome to you all. Thank you again so much for being here today. I'd like to go around and sort of have everyone briefly just talk about what they do at their organization, so our attendees today have an idea. Patrice, I'd love to start with you.
Hello, everyone. Yes, my name is Patrice. Our organization services the northwest side of Indianapolis. Our catchment area starts at 38th Street and goes to the highway of 465. We go west to 465 or High School Road. And typically north, we go up to Meridian Street. So we service most of the Pike and Washington Township area. Our goal here is to service families from infants all the way up to seniors. We are a family campus. We have a preschool. We also have a before and after care program. We do social service initiatives within the area. Our other approaches to work with our families in this community to get them a secondary education. So we provide a lot of certification programs, working alongside of St. Vincent, Ascension St. Vincent, to help the individuals in our area live and stay in the area and work in the area.
Thank you. Allison, could you talk a little bit about what you do as the Executive Director at the Martin Luther King Community Center?
Sure, thanks. Hi, I'm Allison Luthi. We are at the corner of 40th in Illinois. So our community center, much like Patrice, has a neighborhood area that we focus on. Our primary focus is IPS School 43, James Whitcomb Riley, and their feeder area for that school. And then that includes Butler, Tarkington, Crown Hill, Mapleton, Fall Creek, and Meridian Kessler. And really, it's a 2-generation program model that's working with young children. The goal is literacy in the after-school program and year-round, continued year-round through summer camp, and then working with parents to coach around employment and financial goals, mental health and wellness goals, and their child's education, to address a lot of the things that have been talked about this morning. And then we have a community building component that builds social capital, connects people, and are launching a nonviolence training that takes on the systemic issues that are usually keeping people apart. Social services all the way up to community building.
And Amy Nelson also with us today. Amy, could you talk a little bit about your work?
Sure. We are a nonprofit advocacy-based organization here at the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana. We serve about 24 counties here in Central Indiana, but we're the only fair housing advocacy-based organization in the state of Indiana, even though the states around us all have several. So we do venture outside Central Indiana when we have the resources to allow us to do that. We primarily are here to conduct investigations and to determine if unlawful housing discrimination is occurring. That may be victim-based investigations or systemic-based work where we don't have a victim, but we're looking at a potential discriminatory practice. We do education programs to make sure individuals know their rights and responsibilities under fair housing laws. And then we're also pretty active in the Indiana General Assembly, trying to advance housing laws or trying to make sure that our housing laws here in Indiana do not continue to get worse, amongst other work that we do as well.
And also, no, please go ahead. Joining us as well today, Pamela Ross with CICF. Pam, can you talk a little bit about your work?
Excuse me, sure. So CICF is, I believe we're a 104-year-old community foundation. So we've been in the community for quite some time. You know, overall in general, what we do is engage donors in their philanthropic interest. We're a grant maker, which I think the community knows pretty well. We've done a lot of grant making and investing in our nonprofits for quite a few years. And we also lead community in leadership initiatives. So one of our most recent and probably some of the most profound work that we are trying to do is very much centered around what's been presented today. Actually, Raj Chetty's information is what helped us to shift even into changing our mission to be focused on a more equitable central Indiana and making sure that everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential no matter place, race, or identity. So definitely as it relates to place and race, we have been, and of course, you know, even then again, identity is an intersection of all of the data that you have shared. We have shifted our focus to be, to not run away from conversations about race. At the time that Raj Chetty's information was being shared and some of what we were finding about economic mobility, I don't know to the level that you have shared it today that it was this explicit. I think that, you know, that talking about race and how it affects people's opportunity, targeting it on the actual who is most impacted is really important in trying to change the lives and the trajectory for individuals. So with us, we have 5 leadership initiatives that we have been focused on for the last 3 years. Economic mobility is one, which again, very much ties into this work that you've talked about today. Family stabilization, which we do a lot of work with Amy around that. Housing is one of those factors, but there's several things within that. Neighborhood empowerment and placemaking, which gets into reaching into a deeper level of relationship and understanding, engaging actually with residents, not just organizations and institutions within the neighborhoods, but how do you really understand what's happening, and not, although data is very important, but getting beyond just the data, but the actual people themselves, and empowering them to do, to elevate their own solutions because they do have them. Mm-hmm. Dismantling systemic racism. And I think that a lot of ways that is really what kind of thrust us into the forefront as a leader in this community and also nationally, is because we're very committed to those conversations, that awareness, and people really doing the work to make that change. And I'm thinking that's only 4. There's a 5th one I forgot. Oh, criminal justice reform. Oh, yeah. So yeah, hugely, so that's who we are.
Hugely important, you know, and we do want to talk about some of those solutions, those generational based solutions that CICF is investing in. First, I'd like to sort of go back though, maybe start with you, Patrice. You know, we understanding, you know, that Indianapolis is ranking at the bottom of these numbers, understanding that, you know, Chetty put out this information 5 years ago. And that now we're having an open and honest discussion about it. I think it's really important to hear from you community leaders such as yourselves. Patrice, I'd love to hear what you're hearing from the families that you work with. You know, we heard a lot about how people in some places in Indianapolis are stuck. The system is stuck for them. What are you hearing from families? What's holding them back? Is it generational poverty? Is it race? Is it place?
Yeah, I think from my perspective and from the residents that we're serving, race is primarily that first piece. And again, in my community center, I work with a very diverse community. I have about 7 to 8 different languages within just 5-mile radius. So we have a lot of diversity in this area. But I think the other piece that goes along with that is just systemic issues. When we talk about how do they get out of this stuck place, we're looking at working poor individuals that work every day, that are barely making it through, and they can't seem to get over the hump. And so when we talk about those pieces about how do we help them get over that hump, we still, to me, are missing looking at policies and laws and those deeper systemic things that are holding them back to get into a better place versus, location.
Yeah, yeah. And we know it's going to take, just a sweeping investment. I mean, we need to invest in so many sectors. And he hit on, those places that that people are falling through the cracks. Whether it's school, whether it's socially, whether it's housing. Maybe Allison, you could talk a little bit from your perspective and from the people that you are working with. What conditions are people experiencing in Indianapolis that are holding them back from economic success?
Yeah, thanks. Similar to other communities, I mean, we have a $1 million condominium next door to us, and then 4 blocks away, there's boarded up abandoned houses, right? So the extreme continuum in Indianapolis is pretty prevalent. And I think this data show that what some of us already knew, and folks experiencing this every day already knew. I think one problem in Indianapolis is the housing cost, but also it's the extremely low wages. We've built an economy on the hospitality industry, and those are low paying jobs. So someone asked about substance abuse. When you take out all of these individual decisions and individual situations for families, that just builds an additional barrier. People's choices or mistakes are really irrelevant when you're in a system that doesn't work for everybody. And folks are able to grow their wealth and build on their wealth that they already had and inherited on the backs of poor folks who have all of these barriers anyway. And when our policies build higher paying jobs in places that people can't physically travel to easily, that's just another barrier. So I'm with Patrice, folks are working. The days of people just sitting at home, I don't believe that ever really existed, but the idea that folks don't want to work and they're just they're sitting at home collecting a check is just not true. And I think when you see the place-based work of community centers and you see the place-based work of schools and neighborhood groups and bringing people together, the solution can't be that you're just supposed to move up and out. We can invest in folks where they want to live and give everybody a choice of what school they want their children to go to and what neighborhood they want to live in if we make the right investments.
And let's turn to you, Amy. Allison did mention housing, and we know affordable housing is not just a problem here in Indianapolis, but what is holding people back when they do want to move, when they would like to, go to a different place? What are we seeing here in Indianapolis that's really making it difficult for families?
We have a significant housing problem here in Indianapolis. And if the COVID pandemic didn't show us the importance of housing, I don't know what else that I can show to the public about how important housing is. Indianapolis, before the COVID pandemic, had a substandard housing problem. It had an affordability problem. It had a significant eviction problem. We were ranked some of the highest groups of the country, many cities across Indiana in those rankings. And then, of course, we had a housing discrimination problem. And as both Allison and Patrice have mentioned, we need to make sure that neighborhoods have adequate investment so that people are able to achieve their dreams, including going into homeownership if that is what they in fact want to do. And right now, people are locked out of that, or they're being displaced when our neighborhoods gentrify. And that all comes back to, again, affordability issues. It comes back to those barriers that we continue to experience. Our Indiana General Assembly needs to do a comprehensive review of housing policies to ensure that everybody is being treated fairly. And unfortunately, that just simply hasn't happened to date.
And we know as we've tried to work through some of those policies too, as we've tried to move forward here in Indianapolis, we've seen a lot of resistance from state lawmakers to allow such changes. Is that really holding us back? Is policy really a huge part of it?
It's a huge problem. We need to have more people speaking up across the state of Indiana. And I know that puts the burden upon consumers and tenants to have to do that, but we need to have that happen because our General Assembly has, from my point of view here at the Fair Housing Center, been hostile to tenants and housing consumers. They've overwhelmingly sided with the housing industry. And that has meant then through several legislative sessions, passing a series of bills that, for instance, have banned inclusionary zoning. Now, the only way cities can mandate affordable housing development is through incentives. They can't just mandate it. Just this year, the Indiana General Assembly overrode Governor Holcomb's veto last year of SCA 148, which gutted all local housing codes. We do not know the extent of harm that that is going to cause. Any time that our cities do try to do something like Indianapolis was taking some very small basic steps in passing an ordinance to provide some tenant-based protections that was nowhere near any sort of tenant bill of rights. It was some basic steps. The Indiana General Assembly preempted that in retaliation. So we need more voices speaking up about housing issues.
Yeah. Pamela, I'd like to turn to you. The work that you're doing, and when we're looking at place, I think Chetty was clear that place is so important. In Indianapolis, we can clearly see that segregation has been such a huge part of the issue for so many years, so many decades. What do you see as race? What do you see as the role of racial segregation holding neighborhoods and places back in Indianapolis?
I mean, it's everything that's already been said. It's the aspect of how segregation has worked that I believe that has most impacted Indianapolis is too many neighborhoods just becoming forgotten, and that we speak of Indianapolis in a way that, yes, is wonderful and awesome for some, but definitely there's been a continuous years and years of not listening to and acting upon what's happening in the neighborhoods and really addressing the years of systemic racism in housing that Amy talks about. So now you have where we're trying to address those through investments, but yet at the same time, the harm that's been done to people, to actual human beings, has to be addressed as well. There has to be some level of getting into a deeper understanding of these individuals in these neighborhoods and not going about saying, okay, segregation is the issue. Now, how do we just deal with that? How do you bring individuals into the fold of the answers? And without a doubt, policy, I mean, even when I listen to Amy, I just can't even believe. I mean, it's just unfathomable, the fact that in any kind of way we can believe that as a community that we want to be proud of, that these kinds of things can be going on. So, I mean, we will have a much more robust building of relationships and community at even an organizing level and a community building level, because it is that the burden is put on the individuals that are most impacted. But these are power moves. And when you talk about racism, you can't eliminate that word. It is about power. Who has the power to make the right decision? And we need to start to focus on how can we put individuals who are most impacted, individuals who typically would not be looked at as having the power because they're not the ones with the highest resources, meaning either the social capital or the funding or the money to make decisions. How do you start to empower more individuals to be able to have a greater voice in the State House? But overall, it is that we cannot continue to forget that these things are happening because we have a nice downtown, because we have a nice area, certain areas of the city. If you really want to make this an equitable, really truly equitable community, then you got to stop forgetting about those areas. We have this, Indianapolis is spread out, but it's not so spread out that you will have individuals that have never gone to these areas that have been highlighted, have never stepped, it's just like they don't exist. If you really want to be in a place of equity, and especially racial equity, then that in itself should be something that you do. Travel the full city.
Yeah, and see everywhere. It's something I really enjoy doing, just making sure I'm aware of what's happening in every corner of this city. What challenges? I mean, CICF is well positioned to make some of these solutions. What challenges does your organization still face, though? Even as we're starting to recognize the problem and more accurately be able to pinpoint it. But you mentioned policy. What other challenges are you really facing every day?
I mean, I don't know if I put it as a challenge, but I mean, one of the things that organizations have to also address when you want to get into really doing the work around race and equity is to look at your own institutions first. You need to look at what is your makeup of your institution and how are you doing the work. I think that is one of the places that we started, and that continues to be, how do you have you authentically do the work, every individual doing the work that is focused around racial equity in general. I think the other challenge is that money is not the key to everything. Money takes care of some things. And I always say that with CICF, we have probably more power and influence or access to that than we do funding. And so how do we also start to make sure that we put ourselves in those spaces to use our voices, to use our power, our influence, to make sure that within the sector and the sphere of influence and the tables that we sit at, that we have real truthful conversations about what is really happening. So, I mean, and that's a challenge, because yet again, we're in a place where we want to welcome that, especially in the wake of George Floyd and all of 2020 and what it uncovered about disparities that were already here as it relates to COVID. But it still means this is somebody who I've had this relationship with for all these years. And now I may be challenging the way that you look at this as a leader. So the challenges to me typically around having truthful conversations. It's not just about the investment, and it's definitely about power and who has the power to make a different decision about the things that we hear. The data is very important. It drives our understanding, but the relationships are very important. And it's also making sure that the community is not done to, that there is an essence of done with. And that takes time. And as institutions, that's another thing that we find. Efficiency is in quickness. You can't quickly build a relationship and trust with communities that have been left out for so long.
A lot of work to do. A lot of work to do. Patrice, back to you. You're working in the community every day, and we are reading this report and knowing that there's all these factors. Incarceration is one that really pops out here in Indianapolis. Is that an issue that some of your families face? Either having a family member that's been incarcerated, having reentry, really be a major issue. What are you seeing on that front?
So if I could go back just a little bit with some of the comments, because like my mind is like going. We talked about segregation and how that impacts our communities. And one of the things I want to say about that is that, one, I live in the 46208 area, and I live in a community that we have worked years to try to revitalize. But what we see when we're talking about changing and trying to do this increase in making sure that our residents are more successful, we focus on keywords like segregation and things like that. And the way that we fix it is flooded with funding, or we flooded with desegregation. And what that ends up being in our eyes is gentrification. If it was broken or in a sense unfixable before, bringing in other cultures and stuff to fix it, this is almost like a slap in the face. And so we have to really look at, if we know that there's a systemic issue happening in those areas, those communities, bringing in those power to be's to fix things is not the answer. Making sure that we are providing those economic solutions, changing those deep down systemic policies that are embedded in the system that prohibits us from being successful needs to change, similar to the judicial system and incarceration rates. A lot of those individuals we're looking at, when we looked at those numbers from 78 to the present, we had a big influx of incarceration around the early 90s, 95s, and that really played a big part in some of our communities with the single parents, and then the individuals, the children without that second parent in the household. So we just have to really look at going deeper into what we're changing and what needs to be fixed versus just that surface level. And I'm just not a firm believer that segregation has to be, in a sense, fixed. I think it's more about what's happening in that pocket of individuals, in that pocket of a community, that should be fixed or corrected. And then one other thing that we talked about when we were talking about housing, we talked about how it's very hard for some of our families when so many of the policies are not in their favor. We also have to look at when they move in my community up here up north, 47% of my community are apartment complexes. Out of those 47% of that, 42% of the individuals in those apartment complexes pay more than 47% of their income to live, right? In addition to that, within my community, only 25% of my community has a secondary education. However, 90% of my individuals are working class individuals. So what that's saying again is that we are trying to live in this community, trying to maintain ourselves, but we haven't made it over the hump, and we have to get over the hump. One of the things about our housing issue is that we have a lot of private institutions that will buy out these apartment complexes over and over again, and the conditions of the homes become more unappealing to these individuals, but they keep raising the rents. And the individuals feel like they have to be here because their jobs are close by, and they have to keep working, and they have to keep putting more hours in because they need to make sure that they can stay in these apartments. It just becomes a perpetuated spiral that we have to fix. And fixing sometimes, like Pamela said, does not mean bring in more money. It means fix policies.
And that's what's so daunting, I think, to so many people, is that there are so many aspects of the system that need to be fixed. You know, you mentioned transportation. Again, something that we're trying to move forward with, but I'm being held back on so many levels, it seems. Allison and Patrice touched on it, and I know you work closely with the school system. You know, IPS for years has had some difficulties. You know, what piece does the primary education really play when we're talking about economic opportunity for people in neighborhoods in Indianapolis?
Yeah, and I forgot to mention at the beginning, I usually don't do things like this by myself anymore. I usually bring along a couple of guys from the neighborhood who grew up in the neighborhood and grew up in IPS and were put out by IPS and have found their own path to getting that education that's required for a job. I mean, it's really difficult to get a job without a high school diploma these days. And they're not well-paying jobs to begin with. But I think when I came to the MLK Center in 2015, you know, we were not in a good place, and the local elementary school was not in a good place either. They had 5 principals in 6 years, maybe. And so when there's not a strong community center and there's not a strong school, that just creates opportunity for all kinds of exploitation. And that's, I think, what we saw and are still reeling from the effects of that. But, you know, a child's education, if you're not reading at grade level by the 3rd grade, then your chances of be really slim. And so we've partnered with an organization that really does very basic intentional instruction around literacy. And we're even training teachers from the school on a way to provide this one-on-one learning model, basically because there's a lot of, you know, speaking to the incarceration point, there's a large number of folks that are incarcerated who were never diagnosed with dyslexia. And just thinking about the way that you learn, and education takes such this cookie cutter, you're either going to get it or you're not approach, and you're going to behave or you're not, or we're going to put you out. And there's not this inclusive helping children learn in the way that they need to learn, because again, after the 3rd grade, your chances of catching up are almost impossible unless we're really providing one-on-one support. And that may happen, that may happen at a HSE level, that may happen as an individual tutoring level. But again, the financial decisions that we make and where we decide to put our resources in the education system are impactful. And we're fortunate that the school that's just a block away from us, all the kids still live in the neighborhood. We are able to reach out to those parents. The parents live nearby the school. So there's just not the barrier of them coming from all over the city. Because it gets more difficult, when students in high school, and that school goes through the 8th grade, but when they get into high school, then they're just more mobile. They can go anywhere in the city. Place-based work is more difficult when it comes to education sometimes. But I think, there has to be a community school partnership. Because there's a lot of different issues. I mean, as Pamela mentioned, there's so many different issues going on that the school can't take on, but they need the support so that they can focus on what they're good at. And, making sure that teachers get equity instruction and understand their role in the school to prison pipeline, understanding the issues that are going on in the neighborhood. I mean, there's some basic understanding of working with young people that I think needs to go hand in hand with education, not just teaching the academic part of it, but really understanding how kids learn. And there's a lot of good resources out there about how to do that.
Yeah, I mean, but you see, community center like yours can come in, give some of that basic understanding and really start to, move the needle a little bit. And that's encouraging. I see, again, if you do have questions and answers, we have a great panel of experts that are answering, and it's amazing. So please enter those as we're going along. And I see that Amy is highlighting her redlining video, which is a really great video to understand how redlining has impacted neighborhoods in Indianapolis. Amy, could you, sort of just outline that for us and how we're still tangibly dealing with that here in Indianapolis today? I mean, it's still a real reality for people, and why Indianapolis is so far down on this list.
Well, in the report that we all saw this morning, highlighted that yet again, the impact of that's still being felt in our neighborhoods by these historic redlining policies. We need to also remember that includes things like racial covenants, which are still baked in and causing our neighborhoods to continue to be segregated, exclusionary zoning, and the impact that it certainly had, blockbusting that was occurring well into, the 1950s and 1960s, certainly as well. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 and allegedly then was going to be able to stop discriminatory lending, stop discrimination that was happening, and it's never been funded, never had the enforcement weight that it needs to truly make that difference, because we still see that. We see this in COVID rates. Those are, again, impacted by those formerly redline neighborhoods where asthma and other health impairments that then are impacted by COVID. We see this in life expectancy rates. You drive across our city, which might take about 90 minutes on a busy traffic day, and you will pass through neighborhoods totaling a 17-year life expectancy difference, just because of the neighborhood that you live in. That all comes back to redlining. And it still is impacting us. It's still happening. My organization has open investigations of lenders who we feel are still redlining. We had a case that was resolved in 2019 involving an area lender in the Department of Justice was also involved in that case that dealt with redlining of Blacks and African Americans here in Marion County. So it's still happening. It was mentioned in the comments, appraisal discrimination, right? A Black home shouldn't be valued less just because it's owned by somebody who's Black or in a Black neighborhood, yet we know that's baked in everywhere. And we need to confront that, certainly as well. Our advocacy page, which I'll drop into the Q&A, lists our rental cases that we have found that discrimination due to race or women being sexually harassed by their landlords or whatever else it might be is commonplace, unfortunately, in our city and many other cities, across our country. We do need to address the role of discrimination that still plays in our neighborhoods today.
Yeah, and I mean, thank you for your work and and going after these cases and making sure that, you know, these things have light shed on them, because it is extremely important when we're all focused now on equity more than ever. Pamela, I'd like to go back to you. You know, we hear that Charlotte took such a immediate action when they found out, you know, that they were falling so far behind in the economic opportunity realm. We've done some things here in Indianapolis. What solutions do you think have made a difference, and are CICF focused on, you know, moving us forward?
This may sound trivial again in the way that we typically look at how do we approach this work, but I think one of the major things for us has been in our own internal understanding of how we operate in a mode of a white supremacy culture, meaning, again, not white supremacist, but this is how things get done. This is the right way to do it. And this is who should be a part of the decisions about what to do as well. And I think that as a foundation, and we're part of a national cohort that's really having these real difficult conversations about who we've been and what should we be now, you know, how to change things, to really address things systemically, but also make sure that we're not being patriarchal. We're not continuing to, you know, be colonial in our approach to problems that just continue. And when you're talking about communities of color, and when you're willing to talk about race, you have to also be willing to be in those very difficult conversations. I think for us, sometimes that's where we get challenged the most. And we are willing and owning our part in making sure that we bring people along in our learning journey, but it does take up a lot of our time. I think the second thing though is, and again, time is necessary. If you really want to authentically do this work, you will have to give the time and space for it. I think the other thing is, like I've kind of said several times, is that it's really important to us to learn, and we have developed and continue to develop the authentic relationships in the neighborhoods. So while we're continuing to engage donors and influence them and through their own learnings of how to do their philanthropic, you know, desires of their heart as it relates to the community, do it also through a lens of equity. We're also in our grant making, and even as how we look at vendors. I mean, in order to really do this work, it can't be channeled and narrowed into one piece. And I think, like I said, a lot of times it's looked at through grant making, but we are investing. We have actual partners, you know, that we invest at higher levels. Like this year, we're planning on making a very large investment for us, where we'll actually purchase housing. We will purchase land, we will purchase homes, so that we can help to do our part in some small way, because it's a huge issue, to slow down and eliminate the gentrification that we see. So I think it's just important though to know, like as a grant maker, we are granting, and we are doing it at a pace of how we learn. And we're also though trusting not just our typical organizations, but also some of our smaller grassroots organizations, because we got to start understanding that solutions are in the communities. Assets and gifts and talents are already in the communities. We can't program our way out of this. And you don't need to always create more programs. What we need to do is identify where really good relationships, leadership in communities does exist, and start to invest in that, and somehow start to bring people together. And I agree with what Patrice said. We don't have to look at like, how do you desegregate? Give people just need choices. You know, either this is how I want it or how I don't. But to make it into this is what I'm forced into, and somehow, you know, an all Black or all brown community is a bad thing, to the degree that their homes are devalued so much less, is terrible. Because these are individuals, again, who have gifts and talents, who have desires, who are taking care of their children in the worst of circumstances, still trying to be very, very hopeful. And so I think that just that as a value for CICF, especially as a foundation and a large foundation, is something that I feel, and we've worked on it for several years and will continue to work on it, will make us do the best work in this, not how much we invest. But that's typically what it is. Like, what are you doing? So sometimes it's a difficult conversation. It's a difficult question to answer because it may sound very fluffy, but I can tell you that in the essence of the work, it's not fluffy.
No, I know. It is not fluffy. Patrice, this might have to be our last question, but I wanted to turn to you. You know, what's working for the families that you serve? Is it, you know, better connection with employment, training opportunities, finding rides for people? What's working today?
I think today is really dealing with the overall barriers and trying to eliminate as many as possible so that their mind is on moving forward versus dealing with crisis. And so for us, it's providing childcare as much as possible with little to no cost, making sure that they have healthy food to eat, teaching them how to cook healthy foods, and also explaining to them and showing them how to manage their budgets, and making sure that their school agers and preschool or preteens are safe in a place so that they can continue to work and to continue to take care of their homes. That's what I see is happening in my community here in the Pike and Washington Township. In my neighborhood, I think that what's working now is having individual residents in the community that have a voice and really are fighting for change in their community, looking at revitalization versus gentrification. So taking that time to make those changes, but really looking at the quality of life as a whole, making sure that we're focusing on land, getting rid of brown fields, having green space, and then also working on the capital walkability so that people are not just thinking about survival, they're actually thinking about their future. We have to get past that. And I think that my community and the community I live in are really focusing from that perspective.
I mean, I think it's so clear and important that it has to be done in the community, that the community has to decide how they want their place to improve, and then to have the help of funders and community resources like yourself. So I want to thank everyone. I think most of the questions were answered. We had some really insightful questions and answers. You know, what's the impact if we had jobs that were paying a living wage? Jeremy was able to answer that question. You know, we had a question about public transportation, if that could be more accessible. You know, what could that mean? I think these are all just really important pieces of this puzzle when we're looking towards equity, economic equity for all citizens in Indianapolis. So again, the research is online at savvy.org. It's really important, and they've a long history of research investigating place and equity here in Indy. So thank you all, the panelists, for joining us today. So great to have your insight. If you do have further questions, I'm sure we'll be able to answer them online. Oh, we did have one open question. Church owned 4 lots at 23rd in New Jersey. Eminent domain took those lots, and now multi-100,000 homes sit on those lots, and the church was paid only $1,500 per lot. How can individuals and entities fight against the city making moves like this? These practices continue to keep the Black community from making progress with these moves by legislators. I mean, I think this is at the heart of it, you know, when we're talking about policy and trying to move the needle and being pushed back because of power. Would any of our experts like to tackle that question? You know, really briefly, you know, how can communities that want to get involved, that want to make change, go about that? I'm sure we can have that answered, if not live here.
So I'm going to answer that from a community resident perspective. I live in the Northwest quality of life area. So that's the Unwa area, that's the Martin Luther King Street area. That's exactly where I live. One of the things we as a community did to help with negating this type of thing is becoming owners of our own community, working with our community center, which is Flanner House, and our CDC partnerships there, and picking up some of our property so that we can make the decision on how our land needs to be addressed and how it needs to move. Pamela said that CICF is looking into doing the same thing. It's really about having that voice and being the leaders of your area and going into that revitalization process versus allowing gentrification to happen. I'm going to have to say I'm not a faith-based pro person, because I think you know, sometimes they take up too much land, but I get it. But I think it's more about getting connected to your community and you guys coming together, building that capital, that human capital together and having a voice versus one entity trying to do it all alone.
Community ownership. Thank you. Thank you, Patrice. That's all the time we have. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you everyone for joining and listening today. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Gail Strong, to wrap us up. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jill. Thank you, Pamela, Allison, Amy, Patrice, Jill. Thank you to our researchers who were very busy answering questions during this presentation. So what's next? We encourage you to visit savvy.org. Soon this presentation will be posted. You'll be able to watch it again. You'll be able to share it. You'll be able to explore the data. We hope that you'll listen for stories on WFYI that will tell the complexity of what this data is all about, and we hope engage you in conversation. We hope that you'll learn more about the work of Patrice and Allison's center and explore the efforts of the Central Indiana Community Foundation. We hope you're in conversation and reflection because data can guide thoughtful policy and practice, and it's our shared mission to illuminate this data, the context, and the stories that reveal the possibilities. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for the work that each of you are doing. Have a great day.